Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast at Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Brian Lemasters and Tim Martin.
Our topic today is difficult to say very quickly, so we're going to come up with something else to say, millennialism. Sometimes it's talked about as the 1,000 years that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. We're going to read portions of Revelation chapter 20 just in a little bit here to talk about that. Keelism is also something that's referred to, and I can't even sure if I can pronounce that word right a bunch of times.
I'll probably just say 1,000 years.
Just 1,000 years, but the concept of those things, kelioi is the Greek word for 1,000, 1,000, so that's why sometimes keelism is what it's said. You may see that in some older commentaries, but most of the time today, you're going to talk about some form of millennialism. Now, it is important that we study this because for many people, their interpretation or stance about what this 1,000 years is that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 20, in the beginning of the chapter, shapes their entire interpretation of the end times. And I say that, one's approach to Revelation is challenging and very different in its interpretation. We'll talk about some of that as we go through today. But as we look at portions of Revelation that many people believe refer to the end of this age, so like chapter 19 through the end of the book is sometimes envisioned portions of 19, second coming of Christ, this defeat of all the demonic powers that are fighting against Christians and persecuting them. Now, the time frame of when that happens is debated on doing that. But then we see this binding of Satan for 1,000 years, and those who were killed and martyred and literally beheaded, I think the text says, during this period of tribulation and persecution, they come back to life and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. And then at the end of that, Satan's turned loose for a little while longer, and then it's all over. The Satan is thrown in the lake of fire, and there's the great white throne judgment that we see. And so the biggest and most difficult thing, and Jack Cottrell, I think, says it well, is exactly how this millennium should be understood is one of the most controversial questions in eschatology. So how people interpret this, a lot of times we'll set and we're going to go over several of the major interpretive approaches to this millennium that's talked about here. And really, that's not even a biblical word, just the 1,000 years.
Yeah, and
much easier to pronounce.
Yeah, one thing that I think is interesting about this is there's some doctrines that you can see the development of them over history, or something gets introduced and then there's more debate. But this seems to be something that goes back even to the early church throughout history of different thoughts, and there doesn't seem to be uniformity, I guess, very long about exactly what is to be understood with this.
That's right. And we only have, I think all too often we look back at like patristic writings or church fathers and early writings in early Christianity. And really, we're only talking about maybe a few dozen individuals. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we feel like, or we interpret that represents the view of everybody in Christianity, and that's not true. It's kind of like even we talked about in the history of the Bible. Just because we have a list of the 27 canonical books in the 4th century by one bishop does not mean that everybody agreed on them throughout Christianity. And so, these...
Especially when you think Eastern versus Western churches.
That's right. Big differences in those two that we talk about. So, the views that we're going to talk about are some flavor of those views have been around since early Christianity. Now, there are some things that we'll talk about which are, I would call, recent developments in the past couple hundred years. But debate about this and different interpretations of this go as far back as we have commentary on the book. And we really only have major commentaries on the book from the Western tradition. But we have references to it and references to this, this 1,000 years in other sources.
But luckily, we have Dr. Tim Martin here today to tell us all the answers, right?
I don't know any answers to this. It's one of those things. It's, when I teach Revelation, I teach it from a theological perspective. I don't typically teach anything else like this, but this book demands a different teaching. And I try to think about, okay, what was the meaning behind this vision that John has and this 1,000 years?
Let me pause you there real quick. Why does Revelation take why should we approach it differently than other books?
Well, it's the one book, and I'll say the one book as a whole, that is, it's a blend of apocalyptic literature, prophetic literature, and what I would call a letter or an epistle. It might be like an epistle because it is a letter written to these churches, but it has imagery in it and things in it and symbolism that's not meant to be taken literally. Whereas most other New Testament books, and really most of the Old Testament books, we take what they say to be very literal. the image is in there or something. Now, we do have some strange imagery from Daniel, from Ezekiel, from Zechariah that are used in Revelation and kind of twisted around a little bit. But I don't take this book, any of it, literal. And so that's why I interpret it differently.
So we know that this type of literature is a little bit rarer when it comes to looking at just what the books that we have in the New Testament. But is it rare for that time frame?
No, not apocalyptic literature we see in Second Temple Judaism, where obviously we're talking about primarily the period of time between the Testaments as Judaism developed from its ancient Israelite origins after the temple was rebuilt in the time of Zerubbabel. Judaism, as we see it in the New Testament period, has developed. In Second Temple literature, sometimes we see it called apocrypha or pseudepigrapha. A lot of this literature has an apocalyptic writing to it. We see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of their attitude. And it's a difficult thing to define. We typically think about end of the world. That's not necessarily what all apocalyptic literature was dealing with, but more of an end of an age and entering in of a new age.
Yeah. And I threw that out there just because I want us to recognize going into this that this way of interpreting or understanding this type of writing may be harder for us because we're not used to it, but it was very common to them. Like, it wasn't like wait, what's going on here? Like they would have gotten this message in its original context.
That's right. Christians have an apocalyptic worldview. They just don't know it. We believe that there is a gigantic cosmic struggle between good and evil, and at some point, and it spills over into our world, and Satan can influence people here, and God can influence people here. And one day, God's going to dramatically intervene in human history. We believe in the second coming of Christ, put an end to all those things, wreak judgment upon the guilty, and give blessings to the faithful. And then the righteous are going to go to heaven, and the evil are going to go to hell, and all the evil agents are going to be punished. We believe in that, and that's an apocalyptic worldview, that there's something going on behind the scenes that we don't understand, and John got to look behind the curtain.
Yeah, spoiler alert for for anybody out there that didn't finish the Bible yet, but
that's right. If you haven't finished, shame on you and for doing that and looking at that. So it really is a message, I guess, and I think it was meant to be one of encouragement and hope and justice and the reality of God's wrath. And so embedded in that, towards the end of it, we have this mysterious and challenging 1,000 years that Jesus mentions.
All right, you want me to go and read the first part of it?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
You ready for it? All right, Revelation chapter 20, starting verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he may not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be released for a little while.
Picking up in verse 4, then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their forehead or on their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years.
All right, so Tim, walk us through, I guess we'll look at multiple here, but can you go ahead and walk us through some of the primary, beliefs or groupings of, theology on this?
Yeah, primarily I group them in three. I actually take a fourth approach to this that I'll mention later on. But we have this concept of postmillennialism, and that's hard to say, and then premillennialism, and there's a couple of different flavors under that we're going to talk about, and then amillennialism. And so the post and the pre mean, does Jesus come back after the so-called millennium, which is a postmillennialistic view? Does Jesus come back for the second coming before the millennium, which is the premillennialist view? Does the millennium have nothing to do with Jesus' second coming? That would be the amillennialist view. I tend to take a non-millennialist view of
Tim just likes to be special.
That's right. I like to be different. Typically, that means I'm probably wrong.
Yeah. And the way I worded that earlier was kind of weird because I say groupings because with each of these, you can't put everyone that holds that view in the same box because they all take, or some people take a different slant. Like
Oh
they
yeah,
will
there's
hold,
different things in all these.
yeah, to that overall idea, but then they may hold some different elements when we break down the different ones. All right, so you want to start with the post-millennialism?
Yeah, if we think about it, he is saying that the second coming is after a symbolic millennium. Some people would say maybe it's after an actual fixed 1,000 years. And we want to mention here that I say I don't interpret anything in Revelation as literal, and I don't. Not any of it, especially numbers that are in there because they're used very symbolically. So when I say symbolic millennium, I mean 1,000 years, maybe like we said, a long time, or that seems like an eternity, or it's been forever. Something that's really, really long, and we're using it maybe with some hyperbole, but not trying to be exact. Or I feel like I'm 100 years old. Well, obviously, I may feel like I'm 100 years old, but I'm not 100 years old. But I'm exaggerating, inferring that that's a long time to live.
Will you add another maybe sentence or two to your statement there that you don't take anything literal? Like, what do you can you quantify that a little bit? Like,
yeah, I'm a little bit unusual in my view that I am reserved about even whether I take the 7 churches to be literal letters to those 7 churches, because I sometimes struggle with, and I'm kind of on an island with me and 4 or 5 other people that think about this way. And so I wonder, some people take 1 through 3 as being literal, and then they take 4 through 22 as not being literal, or they take 4 through 18 as not being literal, and they take 19 through 22 to be literal. I struggle with blending it like that. I think as this was being read aloud, and it could have, I'm fine if it got read to those churches and many other churches, and we know it got read throughout Christianity. I struggle a little bit that they would shift gears in their mind as they were hearing this. Oh, I'm not taking this literal. Oh, I am taking this literal. I'm not taking this literal. Or there's literally 144,000 people that are going to be saved. Or like Jehovah's Witnesses take that number to be literal, and some other people take that to be literal. Or I'm going to take, the 7s that we have in there to be literal, or whatever that may wind up being. I think they convey some kind of meaning or some order of magnitude in that way. And so that's how I take it. Like, I don't really think Satan looks like a dragon. In that way. It's just some symbol of him.
I wanted you to add to that, just in case people weren't used to hearing that term used in that biblical way, that you still see truth in this book.
Well, there's a difference. That's right.
Yeah, just trying to add a little bit more.
Yeah, that's right. It's like when Jesus describes, Matthew 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse, he uses a great deal of metaphor there, like a woman in birth pangs and talking about, the time before he's come. Well, obviously he's talking about a time of travail and pain and misery. And so I want to say metaphorically might be the best way to say it, but just in symbolic imagery, what does the imagery convey is what I would mean. So a little excursus there on that. This was popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. It has its origins, this post-millennialism. In early centuries of Christianity, it's seen as more of a spiritual and not an earthly reign, that it's not a literal duration or this utopian paradise on earth, but more like a golden age of Christianity. And early restorationists, some of them, Alexander Campbell, for example, had a publication called the Millennial Harbinger. And my understanding of his belief is he was hoping that we could share the gospel with enough people, a very noble cause, that it would usher in an age here on earth of spiritual Christianity and people doing it, and what a wonderful thing that would be. I know people long for that. We don't work for it, but we long for it. And we sit around and hope somebody else is going to fulfill that. But we would like that to be the age. I think he changed his views later on, but I don't know enough about Restorationist history to know that. And so I know that was a belief at one time that some early Restorationists had, but there were the others that disagreed with it.
Yeah, and studying through, trying to figure out other people's stances on this, one thing that helped me understand this is part of this is, do you view the world getting better or do you view the world getting worse before the second coming of Jesus? So in this situation, it would be, no, the world is going to get better. We're going to see growth, and the majority of the world maybe become Christians, was that hope and that idea there.
Yeah, it depends greatly upon, and this has been a cycle, I am sure, since the beginning of Christianity. I fully think that Paul and other early Christians like the Thessalonians were expecting Jesus to come back in their lifetime, at least for some portion of his ministry. Paul seems to expect, we will see him coming in the clouds, and there's a lot of first-person plural pronouns he uses like we and our, and that we're going to see that. But, anytime there's tough times in this world, whether it's the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages or it's World War II or it's the current political climate in the United States, which we always think everything that's happening in the United States governs the rest of the world. But, is the world coming to an end? Is this a terrible time? I remember growing up as a kid, somebody was going to push the button and nuke the world out of existence all throughout the 80s when I was growing up, or really even the 70s as well. I think that people's belief about whether or not this is going to be heaven on earth or a utopian world, I do think it depends on their outlook about, is the second coming about to happen? I'm one of those people who believes we're not going to be expecting it, that we can't predict it, that we can't know it. Are there signs of the end of the age? Yeah, we have to acknowledge it, that Jesus said that and talked about that, and it'd be like the days of Noah. I think if Noah came to our world today, he'd rather go back to his, in the way that we look at things. But I do think that shapes expectations or hope of that, or when everything's good and nobody's really worried about that, I do think it shapes what people think about what's going to happen after Jesus comes back.
Yeah, and I guess before I share any pushback on this, we had said in our pre-discussions, we wish there was a way to show people graphs and stuff, because it's hard to understand the timeline of all this, but just use it as least amount of words as you can. Can you kind of quickly walk through what the majority of people would believe that hold this view of what the timeline is?
Yeah, of the post-millennialist view.
Yeah.
If you have time and you're listening to this, maybe you go back to it and jot these down as we talk about. But obviously, we have the first coming of Christ that we see about in the Gospels. And then we have a period of growth of the church. And then at some point, Satan is bound up, and this church age begins, this millennium begins. And that may be, some people believe, when enough people believe the gospel, or at some point like that. Obviously, that hasn't happened that we're aware of. And then at the end of that period of time, whatever that is, some people may believe, obviously it's not been a literal 1,000 years. If that began, there's some long period of time that Satan is bound up. He can't affect people in this world. He's in prison. And then at the end of that time, Satan is loose for a brief period of running wild, we might say, or chaos. And then Jesus comes back, puts an end to all that. There's a resurrection of the dead, and then Judgment Day, which is a little bit challenging with the text that we've read, because I don't think this handles what about those people who were beheaded for the cause of Christ and refused to take the mark of the beast and refused to bow down and worship its image. That's not dealt with, I think, very well in this viewpoint, unless it just means persecuted Christians, let's say like in the third centuries of the church, early part of the 4th centuries, where we see people like Diocletian and Adrian and others persecuting the church up until Constantine legalizing Christianity in the 4th century. Maybe that's it, and then that symbolizes Christianity surviving and then thriving. But that just doesn't make any sense with the idea that we're trying to usher in a millennium by spreading the gospel. So I don't know how that. I think there's issues with that, and I also think that there's other biblical passages that are not not in this kind of strange literature, that things are going to seem to get worse before Jesus comes, not get better for you.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think of even the Sermon on the Mount, where it seems pretty clear that there will be more people that don't follow Jesus than that do follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that's what I kind of struggle with, is elsewhere it seems like obviously individuals have hope, and I believe in evangelism and sharing the gospel with people, but I also know we live in a broken world. So that concept seems foreign to the rest of Scripture.
Paul told Timothy, evil men are going to grow worse and worse. Mm-hmm. I don't see any expectation for there to be this golden age before Jesus comes back. And so that leads into the concept of, okay, what if Jesus came back and then we had this millennium? So I can't even say it now.
Yes. All right. You want to walk us through that kind of?
Yes. And what I would say is that there's a couple of different main versions of premillennialism. Let's remind our listeners that pre means Jesus will return before the millennium. And for the most part, people believe in a literal millennium here, a literal 1,000 years. We talked about that Millennialism, that they believe in, and that's a literal interpretation of really Old Testament prophecy and Revelation. A lot of times they blend together Daniel and other things along with Revelation.
Let me add one quote, just in case there's any of our listeners like to read different commentaries. I did think it was interesting. Grudem is one of the rare ones that hold this view, but also doesn't take the literal 1,000 years.
But
he's kind of on an island in this group.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Now, there would, and I'm sure he's not the only person.
But I know his commentaries.
Yeah, he's very unusual that he might believe that it's not a literal millennium, but it still is after the second coming of Christ, that there's some time. One of the things here that typically gets tangled up, and this is really a view that has shaped United States foreign policy towards Israel in many ways, is that there's some unfulfilled promises to Israel, that there's a preservation of the Jews seen in Revelation. Now, that's counter because they're a special people of God. And some of that derives from where we see 12,000 from each of the different tribes, some up to 144. But that is counter what the plain New Testament text tells us, that now all people, there's no more Jew, there's no more Greek, there's no more barbarian, that we are all one in Christ Jesus. There's no reason to believe that the temple is going to be rebuilt. And you know what? I hope it does, because I look forward to getting me some popcorn and watch what happens when the Jews try to roust that Dome of the Rock off the Temple Mount one day, because it will be World War III when that happens. But there's some desire. A lot of this is Israel is also going to be restored. The temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, which is completely counterintuitive to the New Testament and the New Covenant and the plain teachings elsewhere in there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that does impact some people's current opinions of Israel and what our country.
Oh, it shaped the United States foreign policy towards Israel, because we believe that Jews are still teammates in that. And you know what? Jewish Christians are absolutely teammates in that, but so are Slavic Christians and African Christians and Asian Christians. It doesn't make it, or Buddhists who become Christians, if we talk about it from religious and not just a ethnic aspect. There are no more divisions of those people, and we're all children of Abraham, and that's a plain teaching in the New Testament. But yes, you're right. It is something that's prevalent in people's attitude towards it. There seems to be a breakdown of that as the United States goes away from Christian beliefs. We also see less of a sympathetic ear towards Israel as well.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, Tim, but I think the tribulation time period also is a factor in separating the first one we talked about and this one as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I have those in kind of this little timeline we'll get to here. There is a belief there. We also want to talk about a rapture, which is in one of these two flavors. The two primary flavors we see are a traditional premillennialism. It dates back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. People like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria. We see representatives there from both Eastern and Western Christianity. And so we think about this belief is pretty old. And so some people who think premillennialism was made up, not necessarily all versions of it. And so they believe, obviously, Jesus came once before and is born and ministered on this earth, that there's a church age, and then this thing that you mentioned, this tribulation, this times and half a times, 3.5 years plus 3.5 years in Revelation, where there's some kind of time where Christians are going to go through some special persecution by some individual or some agent of Satan. Some go borrow the term Antichristos or Antichrist from John's writing. That word never appears anywhere in Revelation, but some enemy of God's people, and then boom, Jesus is going to come back and end that persecution. There'll be a resurrection of God's people, perhaps just the martyrs. Satan will be bound up, and then we have a millennium. And at the end of that, Satan's loose for a short time, and then all people are resurrected. And then we have a judgment day. So the difference there you see is this addition of the tribulation you talked about, some period of persecution, and certainly in Revelation we see a persecuted people of God represented there in the imagery that we see there. We know that there's martyrs. They're crying out at the throne of God. When are you going to take vengeance for our blood that was spilled? And I think it's trying to give them hope. But we have this concept of that, and then Jesus intervenes. These people have had enough. It's sort of like when Moses saw the burning bush. Finally, God had seen the misery of his people in Egypt long enough, and he was going to intervene in human history in an extremely drastic way and deliver his people. And so that type of typology is something God's people are suffering. It's going to end at some point when Jesus intervenes, and that's in chapter 19 for those people who believe this. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And one thing that I struggle with this is the separation of the 1,000 years of the righteous and then
it's
the unrighteous later. And we talked about this in other episodes, like there's other times where it really talks about it being the day when both of those are handled. And this passage in Revelation 20, to me, you briefly mentioned this earlier, like, I don't see this talking about all righteous people. Like, it seems to be highlighting those that were martyred. And,
That's right.
A
Died in
smaller
tribulation.
number. Yeah. So if you pull that away, like where do we develop this other part of the righteous will all be a part of that first one, and the unrighteous like 1,000 years later?
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile. That's one of the issues with all these different views is, and really, it's one of the reasons I don't try to teach Revelation historically, because there's not one model of hermeneutic or interpretive method that fits everything. There's always going to be some thorn in your side that says, just like you said, hey, I really like all that, but what about the fact that only the people who were beheaded for the testimony of God? Okay, well, so it's just 1,000-year reign for those people. The rest of us will just wake up in the second resurrection. And I think that's the way that it's kind of explained, but that's the way that they tend to deal with it. And it's a utopian world. It's a restoration. The new heavens, new earth for them is a restoration perhaps of this earthly paradise. But we see that new heavens and new earth really coming after Judgment Day. And it's even hard to make this sequential and chronological. You know, if we see 19, Jesus comes back faithful and true, riding down on a white horse, and he's called King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I do think that symbol is Jesus. It's hard to get around that not being Jesus, but we don't have a gimme on that in doing that. And what does it represent? And so it really is tough.
Yeah, and I wrote down a couple questions as I was studying through this. One, and depending on how you translate Revelation, are we sure that this ending here is in chronological order and literal?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's part of it. But my other one that I have, and you may know this standpoint better than what I was reading through, but are the saved and their new bodies mixed in with the sinful in their natural bodies? Like it seemed to be like that first resurrection, you have those righteous ones that get this new body and then continue down to earth with Jesus during this 1,000-year reign, but you still have the unrighteous that have not switched bodies.
Well, they haven't been resurrected yet, my guess.
Yeah.
They would come up at that second resurrection before the judgment throne, the throne and judgment. And keep in mind, people who are supporting these beliefs also use other scriptures from the New Testament and the Old Testament to support what they had. And we want to be sure, even though we may not agree or we may be confused, I believe I think the people that believe in these things are just as zealous about trying to understand the Bible and serve God, and that nobody here that has these beliefs is an atheist or doesn't believe in the inspiration of scriptures necessarily. And so I want to make sure we don't put out there that we think these people are. It's just how they have come to understand things. And it's very challenging to do so. It also holds that some Old Testament prophecies haven't been yet fulfilled, especially things in the book of Daniel. And so the perspective of that, you have to blend that in here as well. And they have good cause to do that. There's some the next one we're going to look at, the next flavor, is probably what I would say over 90% of evangelical Christians believe in, and that's pre-tribulational or dispensational premillennialism. That's really hard to say 15 times.
You want to walk us through a brief definition of those titles before we go through?
Yeah, we think about a pre-tribulational or dispensational premillennialism, and we think about that there's going to be something is added to this that we haven't talked about so far, but I think a lot of our listeners may be familiar with, and that's the concept of a rapture. Now, this concept and this particular view of premillennialism, I think, dates to a guy, I think his name is John Nelson Darby, if I remember correctly, in the 19th century.
I think you're right.
Who began to think about this rapture. And so what we essentially have, they obviously believe, this belief obviously believes that we have Jesus' first coming, we have Pentecost, we have this church age that's going on right now, and at some point, there's going to be what's called the rapture. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, that's not a biblical word. No, it's not. But neither is Godhead. I hate to break people's hearts about that right there, but neither is Godhead. Divine nature is what that is best translation.
You've been breaking people's hearts
I've
since
been
high
breaking
school, right?
people's hearts since high school, brother. But the concept, however, is founded when Jesus talks about two people will be working in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. That language that seems like all of a sudden righteous people leave, but there are some people who are left behind. And there was obviously a fictional book series about that. It wasn't meant to be fictional, I guess, but somewhat of a Christian fiction, that they don't all take gone at the same time. And so this view is there'll be a rapture, and let's just say, I'm going to assume for a minute you're a righteous Christian. I don't know, that's debatable, but disbelief would mean like you and I know I'm a righteous Christian. You and I would just vanish one day. Jesus is not going to come back to the earth all the way. He's going to maybe come in the clouds or not come. We're not going to even perceive it, but you and I are just going to vanish. and I guess our cars are going to wreck into walls, airplanes are going to fall out of the sky, all this kind of stuff, and nobody's going to know. And then after that, there is this time of a 7-year tribulation. There's Antichrist. There's wars. This guy's the temple is going to be rebuilt. He's going to go sacrifice a pig on the altar and defile the temple. All these things that I think are manufactured, but they are taking things in Revelation that I think were fulfilled in the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes IV in that day and time and bringing them forward. Then after the Antichrist runs wild for a little while, then boom, Jesus is going to come back again. He's going to destroy the Antichrist. Which is thought to be the first beast, and his agent, the second beast. They're working for Satan. Jesus is going to defeat them. He's going to throw them into the lake of fire. He's going to bind Satan up. There's going to be a resurrection of the saints, and there's going to kind of be maybe a first judgment day. Satan's going to be bound up, and then the saints, which we'd have to say, okay, what are the saints? Are they the people who were martyred during this time that the Antichrist was running roughshod over the church, or are they all the saints? I think we have to look at the text and say, well, it would be the people who were martyred and killed. So remember, all the other Christians have already been raptured away. And so hopefully some people without any Christians on this planet are going to come to Christianity in this 7-year tribulation. If there's nobody here to tell them about Jesus, I don't know how that's going to happen, but maybe it would. And then Satan's bound, and then there is an earthly reign of Christ because he came back to earth with his second coming with these saints that were resurrected. At the end of that, Satan is going to be loose briefly, and then a resurrection of the wicked, and then the great white throne judgment day. Now, that's a lot of things to walk through, but just in a general timeline is at some point in this church age, Christians are going to be taken away, whisked away to the sky or just disappear. And then there's going to be a development of time over 7 years where some foreign power or some individual becomes like the ruler of this whole earth, which that would be a monumental achievement, one would have to say, and deceives a bunch of people and they worship him and all that. And during this time, somehow people come to be Christians. I don't know how that's going to happen. But eventually Jesus comes back physically to earth, puts that to an end, punishes the wicked, and then begins a literal 1,000 calendar year, 1,000 trips around the sun type millennium there in the middle. So if that was clear as mud, I don't know. There is a third flavor of that too we got to mention.
Yeah, what's the third one?
Okay.
This post.
And like I said, that would be, some people that are old as me will remember Hal Lindsey's, the late great Planet Earth book back in, I think, in the late 70s. This was really a popular thing talked about in the 80s and 90s. And just like you said earlier, primarily because everybody was concerned that the United States and the Soviet Union were going to make life extinct on this planet. And so people thought about the end of the world a lot. And so that became very popular and into the 90s. I found out this day and time, even in evangelical Christianity, this is not a topic of a lot of stuff. And unfortunately, there's a lot of quacks out there too that you got to be careful of in this day and time. But there is a post-tribulational premillennialism, I can't even keep saying that we see that the church age would happen, then some period of tribulation yet to come. Maybe it starts next week. Maybe it starts 2 years from now, whatever that is. And then Jesus comes back again. And so we don't have a rapture here. We don't have any intervention by God or Jesus before the tribulation. So the second coming is after the tribulation. There's no rapture that we see here. And so we see the second coming. There's a resurrection of the saints, this literal millennium, and then judgment day and the resurrection of everybody else. And then we see, what we would call new heavens, new earth type situation. So we have several different versions of premillennialism, meaning Jesus, essentially their teaching is, and I say there because I don't happen to agree with it, but the teachings of those who follow it, who are highly intelligent people, believe that Jesus is going to come and really have a literal millennium on this earth that he reigns, which I'm cautious to do that. Right here in the middle of Revelation, we're going to take something literal. But on either side of it, we're not going to. And so I don't feel like we can pick and choose numbers that are literal or not. Because I guarantee you the people that believe in premillennialism don't believe that the 144,000 number is a literal number. If not, there's just really not going to be that many people in heaven. Because we see multitudes upon multitudes and great multitudes talked about in other places in the book.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this, we recognize that this is hard to, without seeing it on paper, these timelines.
Oh, it's impossible.
It's hard to
do a
grasp
search.
all this,
You can find a search of these graphs very, very easily out there. If you just search millennialism, or different forms of millennialism and try to look at an image of that, you can see those things. And like I said, even the descriptions I gave, they're going to vary depending upon, other elements in there, like the rebuilding of the temple, other things that are taught there.
All right. Let's go to our third major one before we go to the 10 category.
How do we do that?
All right. What about this amillennial?
Amillennialism, anytime we put a in front of something, it means like anti or against that we have. So amillennialism does not believe in a literal millennium at all. I do believe, my research is that this increased in popularity in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Christian age, that the millennium, the 1,000 years that's mentioned in Revelation 20, is symbolic and represents the present church age. Now, there's some issues with that because how do we deal with these people that were beheaded for the cause or beheaded during this persecution? They believe that all prophecy and promises related to Israel were fulfilled in Christ and the church. I believe that. I agree with that. I think everything that was predicted in the Old Testament was either fulfilled in the Old Testament or fulfilled in the coming of Jesus Christ. I don't believe there's anything left to unfold there. Like I said, there are people that disagree with this.
Yeah, and that's just add a comment. That's a big difference than the premillennials. That's so hard to say. The pre one.
Just say the pre's.
Say the pre's, where it's tied to Israel coming back, to where it's those promises weren't all fulfilled because they rejected Jesus. So those are going to be still fulfilled in the future. So that's like a big.
That's right. And it's not anti-Semitic to say that Israel, from the Christian theology perspective, is no longer the exclusive people of God. It's a plain New Testament teaching. That's not a hate speech. It's not anything negative. Jews or any ethnic group of people or any religious group can become Christians. They are no longer an exclusive group of the people of God, and they no longer have any special privilege. The Torah is done away with. All that is abolished in Christ and the cross, and we have Galatians, we have Romans, we have all kinds of things where we see that those things are done away with. And so, but there is still a belief, and it's one of the reasons when they go back and say some of the prophecies in the Old Testament have not yet been fulfilled, and they see, for example, John measuring the temple in Revelation, in the Apocalypse. They believe that this is a preparation for reconstruction of the temple, and there's something about that. However, I think the New Testament is very anti-temple. Very much against the temple, and it being that it no longer matters. You don't need the temple. We have a new high priest. He goes before God with it. There's no need for a Holy of Holies. And so I want to be clear that this is not an anti-Semitic point. It's just a theological point that the New Testament teaches.
Yeah. So walk us through the timeline of this one. If there's not how's it different than the others?
Like I said, many different flavors. I try to come up with. We have the first coming of Christ, which we would say when he was born of the Virgin Mary, and that Satan was bound by Jesus' ministry. I'm a little bit challenged by that, but I know Jesus did cast out demons. He did a lot of things to defeat Satan, and perhaps defeating Satan by rising from the dead, that's okay in mind. But the entire church age, maybe Satan's bound at Pentecost, for example. We have the entire church age here is meant to be the quote-unquote 1,000 years. That it's not literal, but it just means a very long time, which obviously it's been 2,000 years since that has happened. At the end of that period, at the end of the church age, Satan is loosed to do whatever, God has given him long enough leash to do. And maybe there's some persecution of God's people again that we see, or maybe this entire persecution is yet to happen. And then Jesus comes again. We have this second coming of Jesus. He puts an end to it. Satan is punished. And then immediately we have everybody's resurrected and there's a judgment day. Like I think probably most people that I know of, like for example in this congregation, probably believe that it's second coming, resurrection of everybody, and I think this is what we see in other places in the New Testament, in judgment day. It seems to be very sudden. I don't know what our sense of time is going to be like on that. We talked about that in our other things. Yeah. The issues with this, I think, are, okay, we keep going back to what about these people that were beheaded? They seem to, the text, in whatever symbolic meaning it has, says they are going to come to life and reign with Jesus for 1,000 years. Okay, so what does that mean in the amillennialist point of view? Are the people who were persecuted in the 3rd century of the Christian era, is that what it's talking about? And the church age has come in? Did it begin with Constantine's Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Did it begin with Pentecost? where is this persecution of Jesus's people in this belief system? It's hard to figure out. And like you said, there's a lot of beliefs in Revelation. We always look at it kind of chronologically, but like you and I talked about, some people see the seal judgments followed by the trumpet judgments followed by the bowl judgments as successive chronological occurrences. Some people see the seal, the trumpets, and the bowls as different ways of saying the same thing or increasing levels of intensity of the same thing. And so you're right, what you said earlier. We want to be very careful that is time unfolding in John's vision, or is John being given different visions that are not necessarily one follows the other?
Yeah, because Jack, who you quoted at the beginning, I think he takes that stance to whether it's the cycle, that there's not just this build up to one victory in Jesus, but that there's multiple visions where he has the victory or whatever.
What do you think? What do you think, Brian?
I was going to ask you one more question on that, but now I forgot what it was. All right. We'll come back to it in a minute. But what I struggle with, and I would lean, I agree the most with this, with the third camp, but when it comes to Revelation, and I can't take confidence in it anywhere just yet of exactly this, but I lean into the idea here that I think this is a message addressed to Christians at this time, to give them hope and to address some things that they're currently going through. The little bit of study that I've done for it, there seems to be a pushback on the government at that time of saying, no, true power lies with Jesus. It's not in the Romans. It's not in these other things that you see in life. Where's your allegiance going to lie? You need to place it with Jesus because Jesus is the one that's going to have victory in the end. So 19, 20, 21, I'm not sold that this is a chronological order of events. Like, I think it's, in my mind, just a bigger message being spoken to that, hey, there is victory in Jesus. Like, there's possibilities here to where, well, why is Satan even thrown in prison as opposed to just handled the way the beast is handled in chapter 19? Like, why even put him in prison? Like,
why loose him? Why loose
like,
him?
And then why loose him and stuff? Well, could it be because early in the book, other Christians at the time were referenced being thrown in prison? So this is yes, you face this, but hey, know that Satan's going to face much more than that. So some of it could be just speaking hope and promise to those that are looking for faith. Maybe they're going through I know there's debates about what kind of persecution they're facing at the time. But so I think it's possible that he's speaking to people in a historical setting and talking to them about things that they are facing and giving them hope for the future that is not taken in a literal stance. We're all like, do I think I'm going to get a mansion one day? Or they're like, we sing the song Someday that there's streets of gold. Like, I don't actually think that's probably what heaven looks like or those things, but I think it's communicating to me that, oh, I have a home, I have security, I have a place where I'm going to be taken care of, that I'm part of the family of God, and it chooses to describe those things in that way. One example of that, we were talking about this before we started recording, was I was listening to a friend earlier talking about Revelation. The nations are destroyed in 19, but then they pop back up after the 1,000 years where Satan recruits the nations again. So it's like, well, if they were destroyed, well, where are they in 20 as well? So I just don't know that it's supposed to be taken as our map or our guide to understand the second coming and all these things that are supposed to be taken. I just take it as, have faith that God defeats Satan. God is stronger than Satan. Vengeance and justice is going to be had. And this is the way of describing it kind of in a poetry kind of way there.
We have to think about, for our listeners, what we really want to do is, how can the Bible speak to us today? And I think, and I know, in most cases, we have to understand how it spoke to its original audience first, because I don't believe the Bible can mean something it never meant. Now, there are those who take a much different interpretive approach to the Bible. They believe that the Bible can speak in different ways to different people throughout time, in different languages, in different countries. And I think so. I agree with that, but not without understanding the underlying purpose of the text. And I think you've hit the nail on the head with, rather than sit back and wring our hands about how the world's going to end, or if those who are persecuted for Christ's sakes are going to have a literal millennium on this earth or not, what difference does that really make versus us reading it from a perspective of, obviously it was not meant to be worrisome to its original audience or frightening to them. It was meant to be encouraging to them. And we constantly see at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, these things which will take place soon. Well, there's no way an audience sitting there would think, oh, okay, all this is going to happen some 2,000 years after I'm dead, or it's not even going to have happened 2,000 years after I'm dead. There's nothing encouraging about that. Could it mean something in the coming centuries? Maybe, perhaps. As you mentioned earlier, the evidence for a persecution of Christianity under the reign of Domitian is late, it's secondary, and it's vague. But it is there, and it can't be ignored. Whether or not it was of the same nature as others that happened in the 3rd century and really into the early 4th century, I don't know. But it really doesn't make any difference if we just think about the message that you talked about.
Yeah, and I think of an example like towards the end of James, like there's a message there of, hey, you who are being mistreated, like know that God is going to bring about vengeance, or like you will receive your reward, they're going to be punished. You know, like that type of terminology is sprinkled throughout the whole New Testament, and we don't know exactly when that time frame comes, but there's still that message of hope, like you were saying, of in the near future, like there's going to be that deliverance there.
Yeah, to me, the most challenging thing that we see in Revelation is we do not see a love your enemies as yourself mentality. We see a God of wrath and vengeance and punishment and condemnation, and we really don't like that compared to the Sermon on the Mount Jesus, where we talk about loving your enemies and do good to those who despitefully use you and persecute you. Blessed are you when people say bad things about you and persecute you for my name's sake. And even consider it all joy, my brother, when you face trials. Revelation, the people who face trials were like, they didn't consider it joy at all. They considered it, when are you going to avenge our blood, God? When are you going to do that? That's what they say to the throne of God. And he tells them to be patient, that it's going to happen in that time. And so to me, the more challenging struggle is I very much see a God like I see in the Old Testament, where he enacts his vengeance on people even before and outside of Judgment Day. You know, like you just said, all these nations are slaughtered at the end of 19, and the birds feast upon their flesh. That's not in that love your enemies passage that we see. But I think today people have come to believe in a false God or a false view of Yahweh as a puny God. I don't believe Yahweh is a puny God. I don't believe he needs Tim Martin to defend him. I believe that Yahweh can intervene in human history anytime he wants to. I believe God can destroy his enemies anytime he wants to. I believe God can open up a gaping hole underneath a group of sinners and swallow them up into the earth. The fact that he hasn't done that is his choice. Anytime he wants to end this world, he can by sending Jesus back again. And so what I see here is something that's very sobering, that I don't want to be on the wrong side of God and be his enemy, because his enemies are going to be severely punished. Both human and supernatural enemies are going to be severely punished. And this should be very sobering to us.
Yeah, and I wonder, and I may have the wrong perspective here, but I kind of view a difference between the Sermon on the Mount. Oh, yeah, we just saw the time, how long we went. All right, I'll wrap this up quick, but I want to add a point there is I wonder when we think of Sermon on the Mount, there's a very personal, one-on-one relationship with those other person that wrongs you and you're supposed to love your enemy. How I view Revelation is not so much this individual that maybe like persecuted you, but this power, whether it's Satan or whether it's the government to where they're claiming to be God and the ruler of all people, you know, like more of that idea versus
corporate punishment.
Is, yeah.
But we do know individuals are going to be sent to hell.
Oh, yeah.
Those who took the mark of the beast, all those things. But I agree with you that we're looking at a corporate punishment of people and being thrown in the lake of fire. All that happens to God's enemies. But what I'm saying is we've taken those individual statements that you mentioned, and we've painted a picture that Jesus would never condemn anybody, and God would never send anybody to hell. Oh, yeah, and that's just garbage. It's just really just garbage. I am afraid of God's judgment. And I don't want to be on the receiving end of whatever it is that happens to befall. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And so, I think sometimes we take those things too far versus just realizing what they are. And I think this is a very good book of that, and a good message of hope and justice in God's wrath.
Yeah. My final thought for our listeners here is there may be things that we don't know in Revelation of how
Maybe. There are things.
There are things here that we're not sure exactly, well, does this mean this or does this mean this? But the overall message and the overall themes are still I can't even speak, crystal clear, and that God holds the power. God is the one that is going to bring about judgment. He is going to defeat Satan. There is victory for those that follow him. Like, all those things are clear. Now, how he describes those, sometimes there can be confusion in there, but the message is still there in a very comforting and hopeful book here.
Yeah, I agree. And my final thought is because I only see hubris and arrogance in the interpretation of this passages or Revelation as a whole, generally in people who have no reason to have the hubris and arrogance. They haven't done the research. They really haven't done the lifelong study that somebody can do in this book to know the different views. And so I just encourage people not to be too dogmatic and not to be too worried about proving everybody wrong or having a certain view. You've got a lot of work to do if you want to study even this topic of millennialism. You've got years of study to do, a lot of money to spend. I invite you to do that. Hopefully what we've done here today is giving you some key thoughts that will help you in future study. But just be careful about being too arrogant about this. Let's concentrate on what Brian said. It's really the theological message of Revelation that should be encouraging and hopeful to us.
I love how right before we started, I said, I feel like we may go a little shorter today. To our fellow students,
that's right. You're not a prophet.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on Tech Support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.